Before we begin this incredible story, I need to ask you something. Have you ever given your all to someone who didn't appreciate you? Have you ever been the one who showed up when no one else would? If you've ever felt invisible despite your sacrifices, this story will touch your soul. Make sure you subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one need to be shared. If you've ever been undervalued, this is your vindication. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful gift is knowing you're not alone in your struggle. Let's begin. Imagine giving 25 years of your life to a family, raising children who aren't biologically yours, paying for their education, their cars, their failed businesses, standing by their mother through illness and health. Now imagine sitting in a lawyer's office after she passes, only to discover you've been left nothing. Not a dollar, not a memory, just gratitude. This is Leonard's story. In a sunlit law office in downtown Atlanta, the ceiling fan turns slowly overhead, casting subtle shadows across polished oak furniture. Outside, the city hummed with life, car horns, voices, the steady rhythm of a place that never stopped moving. But inside these walls, time seemed suspended, hanging heavy like the scent of leather-bound books and expensive cologne. Leonard Williams sat in the back row, his large hands folded in his lap, his dark suit freshly pressed for the occasion. At 68, his face carried the dignified lines of a man who had worked hard his entire life. First as a contractor, then as the backbone of a family that never fully embraced him. His dark eyes, usually warm and patient, now held a weariness that went beyond grief. This wasn't just about losing Helen. It was about what came next. On the mahogany desk at the front of the room sat a silver tray of untouched coffee and shortbread cookies. Leonard had arrived early, setting up the refreshments himself, a final act of service for a family gathering he knew would test his strength. The lawyer had thanked him, but the gesture felt hollow, perfunctory, like so many other acknowledgments over the years. Across the room sat Helen's 3 adult children, Clara, Andrew, and Mitchell Whitmore. They were dressed in designer black, but their expressions betrayed impatience rather than grief. Clara, 47, tapped manicured nails against her phone screen, pausing occasionally to push back a strand of salon-highlighted hair. Andrew, 45, kept checking his Rolex, as if he had somewhere more important to be than his mother's will reading. Mitchell, 42, leaned back in his chair like he owned the room, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, gaze sweeping over the office as if mentally appraising its value. None of them acknowledged Leonard. They never really had. When they'd arrived 15 minutes late, they'd brushed past him without a word. No handshake, no nod, not even the courtesy of eye contact. 25 years and still a stranger, not family, not even a friend, just the man who happened to be married to their mother. Leonard had stopped expecting more years ago. But today, in this moment, the exclusion cut deeper than usual. This was, after all, the final chapter of his life with Helen, the last time they would gather in her name. He'd thought, perhaps naively, that shared grief might finally bridge the gap between them. It hadn't. Leonard's mind drifted to 27 years earlier, the summer of 1998. Helen had hired him to renovate her kitchen after her divorce. She was frazzled, sharp-tongued, but warm beneath the surface. He remembered how she'd stood barefoot on that old linoleum floor, arms crossed, pointing at every cabinet she wanted gone. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and there was a smudge of something, maybe chocolate, maybe coffee, on the sleeve of her expensive blouse. "You're the contractor, right?" she'd asked, eyeing him with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Leonard had nodded, holding back a smile. "Only if you don't scare easy." She didn't laugh then. But she did 3 weeks later, over a shared sandwich and stories of broken homes. They sat on her back porch, surrounded by lumber and tools, the kitchen half dismantled inside. She told him she didn't trust anyone anymore. Not after what her ex-husband had put her through. He didn't ask her to. "I've got 3 kids who hate the world right now," she'd said, looking out at the manicured garden her ex had insisted on but never tended. "And I'm not sure I'm enough for them." "Kids are resilient," Leonard had replied. "They just need someone steady, someone who shows up every day." "Is that what you do, Leonard? Show up every day?" He had looked at her then, really looked at her, and nodded. Yes, ma'am, that's what I do. Have you ever met someone who changed the course of your life? That person who appeared precisely when you needed them most? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. Love didn't arrive all at once. It came in slow, gentle waves. A cup of coffee left for him in the mornings, placed on the makeshift workbench in her kitchen. A folded blanket on the porch swing after long days when he'd stay late to finish a particularly tricky piece of cabinetry. And finally, a trembling invitation to dinner. Just dinner. At a small Italian place downtown, away from the eyes of neighbors, and most importantly, her children. She wore a blue dress that brought out the flecks of azure in her eyes. He wore the only suit he owned, slightly too tight across the shoulders. They talked about everything except the growing feeling between them, the way her smile made his heart race, the way his steady presence calmed her constant anxiety. "My kids," she'd said toward the end of the night, wine glass half empty before her, "they're going to be difficult about this." "About what?" he'd asked, though he knew. "About us. About whatever this is becoming." He'd reached across the table then, covering her hand with his. "Then we take it slow. We do it right." But everything changed the moment Clara walked in on them sharing a kiss in the newly finished kitchen. Her face had transformed from surprise to disgust in the span of a heartbeat. "Mom," she'd said, her voice dripping with accusation, "what are you doing?" From that moment on, her children hated it, hated them, hated him most of all. Behind closed doors, they called him the handyman, sometimes even to his face. Clara was 20 then, attending an expensive private university her father's money had secured. Andrew was 18, freshly graduated from boarding school and headed to Yale. Mitchell was 15, all attitude and expensive sneakers, determined to be as difficult as possible. All three raised with privilege, private schools, and summer homes. Everything Leonard had never known growing up in South Chicago, where his mother had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and his father had disappeared before he'd learned to walk. "They just need time," Helen had whispered one night, 6 months into their relationship, as they lay in the darkness of her bedroom. She rested her head on his chest, her words vibrating against his skin. "They're not used to someone like you." Leonard had swallowed that sentence whole, knowing exactly what it meant. Not just someone without a degree or for money. It was everything. His skin, his story, his silence in rooms where everyone else spoke with the casual confidence of those who'd never been told to be quiet. Still, he stayed, not out of desperation or lack of options, but because beneath the discomfort and occasional humiliation, he'd found something real with Helen. Something worth fighting for, and maybe, just maybe, something worth proving to her children. When Clara couldn't afford final semester tuition after her father refused to pay, claiming business losses that didn't prevent him from buying a new Porsche that same month, Leonard quietly wrote the check. $15,000 from his personal savings, money he'd been putting aside for years to maybe start his own contracting business someday. "You don't have to do this," Helen had protested, eyes wide with shock when he showed her the receipt. "I know," he'd said simply. And that was that. When Andrew needed a co-signer for his first car, Leonard signed without hesitation, despite knowing the risk to his own credit if Andrew defaulted. Which he did, 3 months later, forcing Leonard to make payments of $450 a month for the next 2 years. Andrew never thanked him, never acknowledged it, just took the keys and drove away, radio blasting. When Mitchell's first restaurant failed, a trendy fusion concept that burned through $200,000 in just 8 months, Leonard mortgaged his own property to fund a second attempt. A food truck this time, more modest, more practical. Mitchell had rolled his eyes at the suggestion that he start smaller, but eventually agreed when no other investors materialized. "I'm doing this for Mom," he'd clarified, ensuring Leonard understood his place. "Not for you." Leonard had nodded, signed the papers, and spent weekends helping renovate the truck when Mitchell's friends proved unreliable. He took no credit, no pride. He did it because Helen loved them, and he loved her. Because to him, love meant stepping up even when no one applauded. And now here he sat, among those who had never clapped for him once. Have you ever sacrificed for someone who couldn't or wouldn't see the value in what you gave? Drop a heart in the comments if you know that feeling. You're not alone. Helen had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 5 years ago. The disease moved quickly, cruelly, stealing her memories in chunks rather than pieces. Leonard had been her caregiver from day one, learning to navigate the healthcare system, researching experimental treatments, converting the downstairs study into a bedroom when stairs became too difficult. Clara visited monthly, always with an excuse about why she couldn't stay longer. Andrew called occasionally, asking for updates, but never how he could help. Mitchell showed up randomly, usually when he needed something, spending more time complaining about his mother's condition than actually sitting with her. Leonard was the one who held her hand through endless doctor appointments, who learned to cook her favorite meals in ways she could still eat as swallowing became difficult, who sat beside her bed, reading aloud from the classics she'd always loved, even when she could no longer follow the stories. In her final weeks, when lucidity came only in brief, precious moments, she'd looked at him with sudden clarity and whispered, "You were the best decision I ever made." He'd held on to those words during the funeral, during the reception afterward, where her children had positioned themselves as the primary grievers, accepting condolences while he stood in the background, just another guest, rather than the man who had been by her side until her final breath. The lawyer cleared his throat, bringing Leonard back to the present moment. Thank you all for coming. As you know, we're here today to honor the last will and testament of Helen Grace Whitmore. Leonard's chest tightened at the sound of her full name. She'd always insisted he call her Len. It was their private thing. Sweet. Simple. Theirs. A small act of intimacy in a relationship that had weathered so much external resistance. Before I begin, the lawyer Mr. Harrington continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, I want to express my personal condolences. Helen was not just a client, but a friend. I knew her for over 30 years. His gaze swept the room, but lingered nowhere. Leonard noted how carefully he avoided making eye contact with anyone, as if already anticipating the tension to come. Let's proceed with the reading. Mr. Harrington unfolded a set of documents, crisply pressed and bearing Helen's signature at the bottom of each page. Leonard recognized her handwriting immediately, the slight curve to her H's, the way her W's dipped lower than the other letters. Even in her final years, when so much else had faded, her penmanship had remained impeccable. To my beloved daughter Clara, the lawyer read, voice steady and formal, I leave the lake house in upstate New York, along with all furnishings therein, valued at approximately $1.2 million. Clara sat up straighter, lips curling into a satisfied smile. She didn't even try to hide it, turning slightly to catch Andrew's eye with a knowing look. The lake house, a sprawling 4-bedroom retreat on the shores of Lake George, had been in Helen's family for generations. Clara had always coveted it, mentioning frequently how perfect it would be for her own children someday. That house had been Helen's favorite escape. The place she felt most at peace, especially as her condition worsened. But it had also been Leonard's project for the past 2 decades. He'd personally restored the wraparound porch when rot had threatened its foundation. He'd laid the stone path by the garden, hauling each rock himself rather than hiring it out. He'd built the bookshelves in the study with his own hands, carefully matching the original woodwork of the century-old home. His weekends, his labor, his love etched into every corner of that property. And now, with a single sentence, it belonged to someone who had never lifted a finger to preserve it. To my son, Andrew, the lawyer continued, turning the page with deliberate care, I leave my investment portfolio valued at approximately $850,000, along with my personal stocks in Whitmore Holdings, currently valued at $1.3 million. Andrew exhaled in relief, mouthing a silent yes. His right leg, which had been bouncing nervously since the reading began, finally stilled. He'd been worried, Leonard realized. Worried that his years of minimal contact and half-hearted support might have consequences. Those stocks, Whitmore Holdings, had been founded by Helen's grandfather, one of Atlanta's prominent business families. Helen had once said she'd never sell them unless they were desperate. This is our safety net, she'd told Leonard during the 2008 financial crisis, when his contracting business had nearly collapsed. but they'd weathered that storm together. Leonard taking odd jobs, Helen cutting expenses, both of them determined to preserve what generations before had built. Apparently not desperate enough to share them with the man who'd helped her weather 2 recessions, who'd worked 60-hour weeks to ensure they never had to touch that safety net. To Mitchell, I leave the heirloom jewelry passed down from my grandmother, including the sapphire ring and emerald brooch, collectively appraised at $175,000, as well as the vintage Cadillac, which Leonard so graciously kept in working condition. Leonard blinked. He remembered countless Saturdays spent under that car, elbow-deep in grease. The 1957 Cadillac Eldorado had been Helen's father's pride and joy, but after his death, it had sat in the garage, slowly deteriorating. Leonard had researched restoration techniques, hunted down original parts, even taken a community college course on classic car maintenance. He'd restored it not because Mitchell appreciated it. Mitchell didn't even know how to start it properly, once flooding the engine during his single attempt to drive it, but because Helen had asked him to keep it alive for the legacy. "Daddy would have wanted it preserved," she'd said, running her hand along the gleaming hood after Leonard had spent 6 months bringing it back to showroom condition. Now it would sit in Mitchell's garage, likely untouched like a forgotten trophy, or worse, sold to the highest bidder as soon as the paperwork cleared. Leonard's heart beat slower with each line of the will. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift in his chair. But inside, a quiet ache began to form. Not because he wanted any of it. He had never been interested in Helen's money or possessions, but because he suddenly wondered if he had ever truly belonged in this family at all. The distribution continued. A vacation property in Florida to Andrew. Helen's collection of first-edition books to Clara. The family silver to Mitchell. Specific artworks divided among them according to Helen's careful cataloging. The lawyer shuffled more papers. To my second cousin Eleanor, I leave the antique china set as she always admired it during holidays. Leonard almost smiled. Eleanor had only shown up once in the past decade, arriving late to Thanksgiving dinner and leaving early, complaining about the traffic. But even she, it seemed, had earned a mention. Even she was remembered. He waited for his name, waited for a word, a gesture, something to acknowledge the years. The quiet mornings, the difficult nights, the 1,000 small kindnesses that had built their life together. As the legal drone of property divisions filled the room, Leonard's mind began to wander, pulling him backward in time. Back to their wedding day, a simple ceremony at the county courthouse. Helen in a cream-colored suit rather than a traditional gown. Leonard in the new suit she'd insisted on buying him, despite his protests that his old one was fine. Clara, Andrew, and Mitchell had refused to attend. "It's too soon after Dad," Clara had claimed, though Helen and her ex-husband had been divorced for 3 years by then. The only witnesses had been Helen's best friend, Patricia, and the court clerk. No reception. No celebration. Just a quiet dinner afterward, where Helen had apologized repeatedly for her children's absence. "How can they not see how happy you make me?" she'd asked, voice breaking despite her attempt to stay composed. "It doesn't matter," Leonard had said, smiling, taking her hand across the table. "What matters is us." And for a long time, that had been enough. They'd built a life together despite the resistance, finding joy in simple pleasures. Weekend drives, cooking experiments, movie nights where they'd critique old films. Helen had introduced him to classical music. He'd taught her how to fish. They'd traveled when they could afford it, explored their own city when they couldn't. But now, surrounded by the sharp scent of expensive cologne and the rustle of tailored clothing, Leonard couldn't shake the cold that settled in his chest. Had it all been in his head? Had the connection he thought they shared been one-sided? Had Helen seen him the way her children did? Convenient, useful, but ultimately separate from the family that mattered? The lawyer cleared his throat and looked around the room. "We are nearing the conclusion of Mrs. Whitmore's will. There are a few final statements before we close." Leonard sat up slightly, eyes forward. Perhaps now. Surely now. He had waited long enough. The attorney's voice lowered slightly, as if sensing the weight of what came next. He straightened the final page and glanced briefly around the room before reading the last line aloud. "To my loving husband Leonard, I leave my gratitude for 25 years of companionship and care." For a moment, the room fell utterly silent. Then came gasps, quiet, sharp, almost synchronized. The collective disbelief cut through air like a sudden gust of wind. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to fade as all eyes turned toward Leonard. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, frozen, spine rigid, fingers twitching slightly on the armrests of his chair. "My gratitude." 2 words. That was it. After 25 years of marriage, a lifetime of sacrifices, and building a family that was never truly his, all Helen had left him was sentiment. A breath on paper. Nothing more. The attorney, unsure how to proceed, looked up, lips parting slightly, but the damage had already been done. Leonard stared at the papers in the lawyer's hand as if willing the words to change, but they remained the same, indifferent and unmoved. Helen was gone, and this was her final word. No house, no account, no acknowledgement. Nothing. Is that all?" Leonard heard himself ask, his voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The lawyer nodded, a flash of what might have been pity crossing his features. "Yes, Mr. Williams, that concludes the will." Across the room, Mitchell leaned back with a smug expression, crossing his arms like a king surveying conquered land. Clara raised her eyebrows in mock surprise and exchanged a look with Andrew, who let out a quiet snort. Then came the whisper. Low, cruel, cutting. "Guess he finally sees his place." It was Mitchell who said it, just loud enough to be heard. Just quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if challenged. Think about it for a moment. What would you do if someone you loved for decades seemed to betray you with their final act? Would you fight back? Would you walk away? Would you question everything you thought you knew? Share your thoughts in the comments. Leonard heard it. Of course he did. Every word landed like a nail into his chest, but he said nothing. He stood slowly, adjusting his coat as if bracing for cold that had nothing to do with the weather. His face was unreadable, but his eyes shimmered with the pain that comes from deep, quiet betrayal, the kind you never see coming because you trusted too much. He nodded once to the lawyer, not out of respect, but simply because he still believed in dignity, even when dignity wasn't returned. "Thank you for your time," he said softly. Then he turned and walked out. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the marble floor, each one slower than the last. He didn't glance back. He didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. But just before he reached the door, his hand lifted slightly to his face. He wiped the corner of his eye once, then kept walking. No one called after him. No one said goodbye. In the sudden silence of his exit, he heard Clara's voice, already discussing when she could take possession of the lake house. Outside, the sun still hung in the sky, but it no longer felt warm. The city carried on as usual, cars honking, pedestrians rushing by, a delivery man yelling into his phone. Life moved forward, unaware of the heartbreak taking place just beyond the office door. Leonard stood at the edge of the sidewalk and stopped. The traffic light turned green, but he didn't cross. He stood still, staring at nothing. His reflection in nearby glass showed a man who had given everything and received nothing in return. A man suddenly adrift in a life he thought he understood. He thought about the early mornings when he made Helen coffee before she woke. The way she laughed when he fixed the broken heater in the depth of winter without asking. The anniversaries he never missed, planning each one carefully to recreate their first date. The times he defended her kids, even when they disrespected him. Like when Mitchell had shown up drunk to Helen's birthday dinner, and Leonard had quietly helped him to the car, making excuses to spare both Mitchell and Helen the embarrassment. He'd done all of it with love, not for recognition, not for reward. But this silence from beyond the grave, this erasure of everything he had been to her, cut deeper than he expected. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Patricia, Helen's friend, checking to see how the reading had gone. He couldn't answer. Not yet. Not when the truth would stick in his throat like broken glass. Would you have the strength to walk away with dignity after such betrayal? Or would you crumble under the weight of it all? Let me know in the comments. His shoulders sagged. A pedestrian brushed past him, muttering an apology. Leonard barely noticed. All he could think was, why? Why had she left him with nothing? Had he misread everything? Was her love just words? Was her silence around her children's disdain a form of quiet agreement? Had he simply been convenient? In their final weeks together, as the disease clouded her mind more and more, she'd had moments of confusion where she'd call him by her ex-husband's name. He'd never corrected her, never shown how much it hurt. Was that confusion revealing a deeper truth? Had he always been second place, a replacement rather than a choice? He wanted to scream. But Leonard didn't believe in rage. Not out loud. He'd been taught all his life that the world already expected his anger, already feared it, already had prepared explanations for dismissing it. He refused to give them more fuel. So instead, he walked down the block, past the bank where he and Helen used to deposit their joint checks every Friday afternoon, past the flower shop where he bought her tulips every spring because roses felt too obvious, and into the long afternoon where questions pressed heavy against his chest, but answers remained cruelly out of reach. 3 days passed. Leonard hadn't returned a single call. Not from Patricia, not from his brother in Chicago, not even from his foreman, wondering when he'd be back at the construction site they were currently managing. He hadn't stepped back into the house he once shared with Helen, now technically Clara's, according to the will. The thought of walking through those rooms, touching things that no longer belonged to him, breathing air that was no longer his to breathe, it was too much. He'd spent the last 72 hours in a small rented apartment across town, surrounded by moving boxes he didn't yet have the strength to unpack. The efficiency unit was all he could find on short notice, its beige walls and worn carpet a stark contrast to the home he'd helped renovate and maintain for a quarter century. On the first night, he'd sat on the edge of the twin bed, still in his suit from the will reading, and stared at the wall until sunrise. On the second, he'd mechanically hung his clothes in the narrow closet, placing each item with the same care he'd always shown, even as emptiness echoed through his chest. On the third, he'd finally showered, eaten something other than vending machine snacks, and tried to imagine what came next. He hadn't cried, not because he didn't want to, but because the pain sat in a place too deep for tears. It lived beneath the bones, where only silence could reach. Then, on the fourth morning, something unexpected arrived. A knock at the door, light, almost hesitant. When Leonard opened it, no one stood there, just a courier envelope resting on the welcome mat. His name was handwritten on the front in a script he recognized instantly. Helen's. His breath caught. The paper was slightly aged, the ink smudged as if it had been written in a hurry or through tears. For a moment he just stared at it, afraid to touch it, afraid of what it might contain. Another dismissal? A final explanation? An apology that came too late? He closed the door softly, sat on the edge of the unmade bed, and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, one folded letter and a smaller sealed envelope marked, "For the attorney, only after Leonard reads this." His heart hammered against his ribs as he unfolded the letter, and with each line, the air seemed to thicken around him, making it harder to breathe. "My dearest Leonard, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I fear I've broken your heart in the process. Please, before you judge me too harshly, let me explain. I wanted to leave you everything. You deserved it all and more. But my children, they came to me months ago with threats. They found out about the changes I'd made to my will after my diagnosis. Changes that would have provided for you completely, recognized you as the backbone of our family that you've always been. They said if I left you a single cent, they'd contest the will, drag your name through court, and paint you as a manipulator who only married me for my money. They'd claim you took advantage of my condition, that you coerced me, that everything between us was built on calculation rather than love. They said horrible things, things I knew weren't true, but the more I pushed back, the more vicious they became. And Leonard, I was scared. Not for myself, but for the peace you so deeply deserve. I didn't want you to spend your golden years battling vultures, defending your character in courtrooms, your name in newspapers. You've spent too many years being dignified in the face of their disrespect. So I made a choice. I created 2 versions of my legacy. The one they heard, the public will, was a decoy. I wanted to see who they would become when they thought they had it all. I wanted you to see it too. The real will, the real plan, is enclosed in the second envelope. Inside, you'll find the access details to the trust I created solely in your name. It contains the house, the stocks, the properties, the art collection, the accounts, everything. I worked with a different attorney, Michael Jenkins. His contact information is included. He has all the documentation, all the paperwork, everything needed to execute my true wishes without contestation. The trust was established 3 years ago, before my condition progressed, with multiple neurological assessments confirming my competence. My children cannot touch it. You never asked for anything from me. But I've spent 25 years quietly building a life for you in return for the one you gave me. You saved me, Leonard. You gave me something no inheritance ever could. Dignity, safety, unconditional love. Please forgive me for the performance I had to leave behind. I only wanted the truth to reveal itself in time, and now it has. I love you. I have always loved you. And in the end, I hope you'll understand that sometimes protection comes in strange packages. Forever yours, Helen. Have you ever misjudged someone's intentions? Thought the worst when they were actually trying to protect you? Sometimes love makes choices we don't immediately understand. Share a moment when you discovered someone was looking out for you in ways you hadn't realized. Leonard stared at the page, the words swimming before his eyes. He read the letter again and again. Each time, the sharp ache in his chest softened, replaced by something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since that day in the law office. Relief. Not for the money, not for the properties, but because Helen had seen him, truly seen him. She hadn't betrayed him. She had protected him in her own quiet, brilliant way. He thought about how careful she'd been in her final months, despite her deteriorating condition. How she'd sometimes look at him with sudden clarity, asking him to promise he'd be all right. How she'd insisted on private conversations with her lawyer that he'd respectfully given her space for, never questioning. She'd been planning, preparing, making sure he wouldn't be left vulnerable to the very people who should have embraced him but never did. He looked down at the second envelope and opened it with careful hands. Inside were printed documents, notarized and signed, bank account numbers, deed transfers, a legal trust in his name. And tucked into the final page, a mission statement. Helen had created a foundation in his name, one designed to fund mentorships and scholarships for stepfathers and guardians of blended families. Men like Leonard who often gave everything and received nothing in return. The Leonard Williams Foundation for Familial Dignity, the heading read. Below it, in Helen's handwriting, because sometimes the strongest fathers are the ones who choose to be. It wasn't just a gift, it was a legacy. The foundation had already been funded with $2 million from Helen's personal accounts, money her children never knew about, investments she'd made quietly over the years specifically for this purpose. Leonard closed his eyes, clutching the letter to his chest. For the first time in days, he let himself cry. Not out of sorrow, but out of gratitude. Out of vindication, out of love. Because sometimes justice doesn't shout. It whispers in letters left behind, in actions buried beneath layers of silence, in a truth that finally rises when everything else has fallen away. And in that moment, Leonard knew Helen had never left him out. She had simply saved the best for last. What would you do with such a revelation? When someone you thought had betrayed you had actually planned the perfect redemption. Would you forgive the pain of those terrible moments of doubt? Would you embrace the gift or walk away from it all? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Leonard didn't return to the law office. He didn't call Helen's children. He didn't storm into what was once his home demanding recognition or vengeance or apology. Instead, he took a deep breath, folded Helen's final letter, and began again. Not for himself, but for people like him. The ones who loved quietly, who gave everything without ever asking for credit. The invisible fathers, the second husbands, the quiet protectors. He contacted Michael Jenkins, the attorney Helen had mentioned in her letter. A silver-haired man with kind eyes and a firm handshake who nodded knowingly when Leonard walked into his office. She was quite a woman, Jenkins said after reviewing all the documentation with Leonard. In all my years of practice, I've rarely seen someone plan so meticulously. She always saw around corners, Leonard replied, his voice steady now, confident in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Always 3 steps ahead. Within days, the legal transition began. The trust Helen had established was ironclad, created years before her condition could be used against her wishes. Every asset she truly valued, the house they'd shared, her personal art collection, the family business shares, significant financial holdings, had been quietly transferred to the trust with Leonard as the sole beneficiary. The reading at the other law office had been, as Helen's letter explained, essentially theater. The assets discussed there were real, but represented only a fraction of what she actually controlled. The lake house, for instance, had been sold to the trust 2 years prior, with Clara receiving only the right to use it during her lifetime. A detail that would become apparent the moment she tried to sell it. Within weeks, he activated the foundation Helen had created in his name, the Leonard Williams Trust. Its mission was clear: scholarships for underrepresented stepfathers and guardians, men who often filled the gaps in broken families but were written out of their stories. He established an office in a modest building downtown. Nothing flashy, nothing that called attention to itself, much like the men it was designed to help. He hired a small staff, including a young woman whose own stepfather had worked 3 jobs to put her through college. Why stepfather specifically? A reporter asked during a small press conference, announcing the foundation's first round of scholarships. Leonard smiled slightly, his hand steady on the podium. Because sometimes the people who choose to be family deserve recognition just as much as those born into it, he said. This foundation honors those who step up without being asked, who love without conditions, who build bridges in fractured families. Applications poured in. Men from all walks of life, construction workers, teachers, bus drivers, mechanics, office workers, finally saw themselves valued. Leonard met them, shook their hands, listened to their stories, and for the first time he no longer felt alone in the role he had carried for decades. Each scholarship recipient received not just financial support but mentorship, legal guidance for navigating blended family dynamics, and connection to a growing community of men who understood the unique challenges they faced. "You're changing lives," Patricia told him over coffee 6 months after the foundation launched. She'd been skeptical at first, worried the foundation was Leonard's way of getting back at Helen's children rather than honoring her memory. "Helen changed mine first," he replied simply. He still lived in the same house. The one Helen had left to him quietly, legally. The same house her children once assumed was theirs to claim. They returned one afternoon, weeks after the will reading, smug and entitled, with printed paperwork and threats of eviction. Clara even arrived with a realtor, ready to list the home without so much as a knock. But when they opened the gate, they found Leonard already seated on the porch, sipping tea, a file of documents neatly waiting beside him. "I'd ask you to sit," he said gently, "but something tells me this won't take long." They scoffed, laughed, called him delusional, until he handed them the papers. The trust documents, the deeds, Helen's signature, the notarized filings. "This isn't possible," Clara whispered, her manicured nails gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled at the edges. "Mom would never." Mitchell began, but his voice faded as he scanned the documents. Andrew paced the porch like a man who'd just bet the house and lost, his expensive shoes tapping an agitated rhythm on the wooden planks Leonard had replaced just last summer. "She did this years ago," Leonard explained calmly, "before her condition worsened, with full mental capacity, verified by 3 separate doctors." "We'll fight this," Clara hissed, but the threat sounded hollow even to her own ears. "You can try," Leonard replied, "but you might want to read the whole file first." At the back was a letter Helen had written to her children, explaining that any attempt to contest the trust would trigger a clause redirecting their inheritances, the lake house, the stocks, everything mentioned in the original will, to various charities instead. She'd thought of everything, closed every loophole, protected Leonard from every angle. Leonard didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply stood and looked each of them in the eye. "You can inherit money," he said calmly, "but character, that's earned." No one responded. There was nothing left to say. They left without another word, the realtor trailing awkwardly behind them, clipboard clutched to her chest. Later that evening, Leonard received 3 separate text messages. From Clara, "This isn't over." From Andrew, "You won't get away with this." From Mitchell, the shortest and perhaps most honest. Why you? Leonard didn't respond to any of them. Their words no longer had the power to wound him. He understood now what Helen had always seen, that their rejection had never been about him at all, but about their own inability to see beyond themselves. In the months that followed, the foundation grew. Stories began to spread, of stepfathers receiving recognition for the first time, of scholarships enabling education for men who'd put their own dreams on hold to raise someone else's children, of communities acknowledging the invisible work of chosen fathers. Leonard expanded the program to include counseling services for blended families, workshops for navigating complex family dynamics, legal aid for stepparents facing institutional barriers. The work filled his days, gave purpose to his grief, transformed his personal pain into collective healing. In helping others, he found that Helen's final gift wasn't just the material assets she'd left him, but the opportunity to create meaning from their shared journey. 1 year after the will reading, Leonard received an unexpected visitor. Mitchell stood on his doorstep, thinner than before, his expensive clothes replaced by jeans and a simple button-down. "Can we talk?" he asked. None of the previous arrogance in his voice. Leonard hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing him to enter the home that had once been his mother's. They sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where everything had begun nearly 3 decades earlier. Mitchell stared at his hands, unable to meet Leonard's gaze. "The food truck failed," he finally said. "Again, I didn't know how to run it properly. Turns out enthusiasm isn't enough." Leonard waited, sensing there was more. "I've been following what you're doing with the foundation," Mitchell continued. It's good work." "Thank you," Leonard said simply. "I don't understand why she chose you," Mitchell admitted, finally looking up. "All these years, I thought." "You thought what?" "That you were the replacement, the stand-in, that you could never love her the way Dad did." Leonard nodded slowly. "I never tried to replace your father, Mitchell. I only wanted to be myself." "I know that now," Mitchell said quietly. "Too late, probably." Leonard poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table. "It's never too late to start over." They talked for hours, really talked, perhaps for the first time, about Helen, about grief, about the complicated ways love manifests in blended families. No miraculous reconciliation, no dramatic forgiveness scene, just the first tentative steps toward understanding. When Mitchell left, he shook Leonard's hand. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps. Clara and Andrew maintained their distance, still burning with resentment, still convinced they'd been robbed of their birthright. Leonard accepted this with the same quiet dignity with which he'd accepted their disdain for decades. Some wounds, he knew, may never heal. And that was okay too. Later that night, Leonard walked through the hallway lined with memories. Photos of vacations, birthdays, quiet dinners. Some had faces he no longer considered family. But others, like the one of him and Helen standing arm in arm on the porch, still brought warmth. He placed her letter in a frame on the mantel, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that love, real love, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's found in sacrifice, in grace, in the quiet decision to rise when the world expects you to fall, and in choosing to build something lasting even after everything else is gone. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what we receive, but what we choose to give. Sometimes the truest form of love isn't what's displayed, but what's protected behind the scenes. And sometimes, justice arrives in its own time, in its own way, more beautiful than we could have imagined. If this story moved you, if you've ever been the Leonard in someone's life, underestimated, overlooked, but still choosing to love anyway, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their sacrifices matter. Because they do. Because you do. And because, in the end, what we build outlasts what we inherit. What we give defines us more than what we receive. And the families we choose can sometimes love us more deeply than the ones we're born into. Thank you for listening to Leonard's story. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones written in invisible ink. In the spaces between official documents, in the quiet acts of love that no one sees but everyone feels.